Welcome to Crossover the Pond, brought to you by 21 Media Productions and Sports Social. He's Drew Lasker, I'm Josh Sexton. This is another episode as we continue our NBA basketball journey, a short hezzy tween and stutter step away here in the UK. And Drew, speaking of NBA basketball journeys, a few young guys started theirs last night. Great to see in the NBA draft. I don't know about you, Drew. Like I stayed up until basically the end of the lottery last night, and my body must have thought that like the NBA season's over now, so late nights aren't a thing anymore. I've woken up so tired off the back of it when I've done like less sleep and come on here with you and been more hyped. Maybe it's just because on a draft night it's a more like, you know, you're looking forward to these guys' careers, and it's a bit less like like it was with the NBA finals.
Yeah, same here. I think the body clock knows that is officially the off season, so it's screaming like, "What are you doing up this time of night?" But with the draft, it's more methodical, right? So it's not like it's action to keep your body alert at these crazy hours. But you know, the NBA draft is just always such a special time. I've been watching it since 1996. With dreams of wanting to be in the NBA, and every year that I watch it and watch these young men live out their dreams, I still have a part of me that's like, man, I wish that was me that was there. But it's officially the new calendar year where every team can turn the page because the hope on the new season begins.
Absolutely. I always find NBA seasons and off seasons especially to be quite strange, because I'm kind of used to like a football season, which I guess almost ends in a bit more of a traditional way. Like once the last game's happened, the break is then until, you know, the start of pre-season and things like that. There's obviously transfers that happen in that time, but they don't usually happen so quickly after the season. Whereas, you know, just last week we were talking about the NBA finals. Now we've got the draft, we'll have free agency that will open next week as well. It always feels like with an NBA season, there's almost like a bolt on to the end of the season, and then you finally get like a slow down period after summer league where, you know, most of the free agency things are done, most of the big trades are done. The guys have obviously been drafted, and then things truly stop. But in terms of this draft order, Drew, I'm not gonna lie. I feel like if we were to have sat down and like all the sort of prep that I'd done before this, in terms of like listening to different people's podcasts, listening to different draft experts, reading big boards, reading mock drafts, it kind of went the way I expected it to go. Like maybe Mikel Brown Jr. to the Nets was the one, Morris Johnson to the Mavs as well, was the two in the top 10 that I was a bit like, okay, like I could have seen somebody else going there. But I don't know about you, Joe, and I don't know how much you really like truly knew about the prospects. I almost didn't know very much, but in listening so much to people talking about that top three, the thing I kind of gauged from it was like, okay, well, there's question marks about Darren Peterson that are like off-court things, which I think are always big. I don't know if red flags is maybe too extreme, but risk going into this. Like, he didn't play very much for Kansas last year. There was all sorts of like off-the-court issues. There was this like cramping apparently that he claimed was caused by creatine, but definitely some people in the media sound like they're even a little bit like about that. So question mark about that. Cameron Boozer doesn't necessarily have like an above the rim game, more of like a ground bound guy. So question mark about that. And then it always felt there was a little bit of a lip then to Caleb Wilson in 4 before a bigger drop off to 5. So to me, I always kind of saw it as like, oh, AJ DeBancer is the most well-rounded prospect here, and surely just the first one guaranteed to go off the board, and that was the way it went.
If I can describe it any way, it was anti-climax from a perspective that, you know how these drafts are, especially the week before. It's just so much noise coming from so many different directions, and camps trying to, you know what I mean, create a little bit of smoke. But ultimately, without, you know, being in the same boat as yourself, without knowing a ton about all of these players, if I could have drawn it out, this is probably how I would have predicted it, specifically the top 4, because that's where all the focus has been. The separator has been really about the guards. When you talk about Acuff Jr. and Flemings, you know, where would they fall? Where would they go? But everything else was pretty standard. What really stood out to me is the NCAA is back. You know, Michigan getting 3 of their guys in the top 12. Winning is all of a sudden you know, a real thing now, again, where the NBA for so long has been about potential, and it still is. I think like 9 freshmen went in the first round, but ultimately now the way that the draft is going to reform next year, how the NBA is going to change. And you already see it, and I don't even know what this period's called because free agency hasn't officially started. But we've already seen with guys getting announced of making moves, specifically with Giannis to Miami and Trae Young getting that deal with Washington. Everyone is trying to position themselves to, you got to win now. So that's the exciting part. The real question mark on draft is who's really going to be an impact. Debansta seems to be very transferable at 6'9". There is questions about Peterson, but one thing that I keep hearing, what I keep seeing, and even from me watching a little bit of his highlights, his talent speaks for itself. And at the end of the day, if there's red flags, a lot of times with these guys, if they're this talented, the talent will outweigh the red flags. And so what you can't do when you're in that top three is you can't miss. So could you imagine if someone like the Jazz would have passed up on Peterson? So ultimately, this thing kind of unfolded exactly how we thought it would.
Yeah, I always think it's a strange thing, particularly in the way the draft is covered, really, because I feel like those moments, like you said there, Drew, are really sort of accentuated in terms of like, oh, you don't want to miss out on this guy, like kind of almost would encourage teams to ignore any red flags that they may feel, because, or imagine like if he is a boom guy rather than a bust guy, and you're the one who's passed up on him, whereas like I've seen it a lot of times with the draft, and I guess it's because it can go either way, really, and there is a big degree to this that just really is the luck of the draw, especially from the point of view of the lottery, of course. But there's definitely been guys in the past where I'm like, okay, like, everything points towards he should be a great NBA player, and it's not been the case. Like, all of these things can go anyway, really. I agree with you. It does sound like Peterson has, like, generational level talent. It's what everyone has been saying about this draft, really. There's not been like a consensus number one guy in the sense of like Victor Wembanyama or Cooper Flagg, because Victor Wembanyama and Cooper Flagg were kind of like almost undeniable talents when compared to the rest of their draft class, really, whereas it felt like at the top of this draft there were basically three guys, you could argue, or at the very least two guys who had like genuinely undeniable level of talent here. So I'm really intrigued to see Darren Peterson, how his game translates to the NBA, because I ultimately haven't seen a lot of it. I don't really follow NCAA regular season. I tend to watch it when it comes to March Madness time, and it was disappointing March Madness for the Kansas Jayhawks, so didn't get to see very much of Darren Peterson there. Got a bit more of a sneak peek into a few of these other guys. The Trae Young deal, I'm just gonna go back to that, Drew, because it's a genuinely really interesting moving piece of this. I think a lot of people saw it as like the Washington Wizards were kind of almost tanking themselves into a bad contract the night before they drafted this generational guy in AJ Debance. I kind of don't see it that way, and I think you're seeing a lot of teams doing this now where, because of these new relegation spots, I'm sure it's because of this, like, teams are now worried about ever having to, bottom out or anything like that. Basically, what the Washington Wizards, for me, have done is almost give themselves an insurance policy, and yes, it might be an insurance policy that comes with a certain level of risk attached, but basically they've now got two guys who they can hand, like, a key to the franchise each, in Trae Young, who's going to, constantly bring the ball up, can be on the Washington Wizards for a few years, because Trae Young's not a guy who's old necessarily, but then you've also got the young guy now in AJ Debance, who you think is going to be, a generational level talent. You can kind of say to both of them, like, you both got responsibilities that are going to be shared here, but in terms of like faces of the franchise, you both have a key for this.
And don't get it twisted, these conversations would have happened before they've come to this contract agreement, which is 4 years, $212 million, if I'm not mistaken, and it aligns perfectly with AJ Debance's contract, because in 4 years he'll be up for his extension. And I would not be surprised before they signed it, Washington would have been very clear with their intentions about first of all, who they were going to select, who they were going to pair Trae Young with, because I don't think Trae Young agrees to this extension without knowing this information. And then also talking about the style of play. And even if it's a case of, hey, we want to, build this team around the young guy. Hey, look, I mean, for $212 million, I don't think you're gonna say no to that, especially when you're in a situation, Trae Young, where there wasn't a huge market for him. So, and is it Will Dawkins? Yeah, Will Dawkins, the GM for the Wizards, in the midseason, I read an article about how, they're done with this tanking thing. Like they are positioning themselves to be competitive in the 26-27 season. And this is before, the new tanking rules or the draft reform was introduced. So this is a team that's ready to start winning. I got to assume this is the same thing with the Utah Jazz as well, the two teams that's been losing for a very long time. But if I do go back to the draft, one surprising pick for me, and the first thing I thought about it was Atlanta, because you got rid of a small guard in Trae Young that was proven to pick up another small guard in Kingston Flemings from U of H. So just curious of what they decide to do there, especially when the ball was in Jalen Johnson's hands a lot last year. So just be really curious to see how Atlanta kind of maneuvers there. But one thing that's very clear that also stands out to me is that, and we keep talking about it on this podcast now, is that I don't think teams are really concerned about having a generational talent. Yes, it would be great if DeBansta or the other guys in the lottery can turn into that. But I think the main thing now is you got to have talented guys on your roster, not one or two. You got to have 8 or 9. We've seen it with New York. We saw it with San Antonio. We see it with OKC. So, this new NBA is changing right before our eyes, and you got to have guys that are firstly versatile, and then guys that can produce, not necessarily needing to be a superstar.
Yeah, I like the Atlanta pickup purely because I feel like, especially someone who's sort of, I guess I class myself more as like a fan media person than like an NBA expert. It makes it easy for me to analyse because it's like, oh, right, so you moved on from like the aging version of the small point guard who, could bring the ball up from you, had a few injury issues in the last few years, to get like just a younger version of that in the draft. Like, it's clear Atlanta kind of likes that prototype of the almost, like, I don't want to compare Kingston Flemings to Trae Young because I've not seen enough of Kingston Fleming's game to say like, oh, that's exactly what's going on there. But like you say, there's definitely that sort of small guard relation between them. I was kind of surprised that Houston didn't go for a Daymara, but maybe they just felt like a Daymara was kind of, 8 would be a little bit too high for him. It felt like that was what they needed when you looked at the playoffs, especially you looked at how they struggled after going 2-1 up against New York, with New York's physicality kind of keeping that at bay. It felt like a Daymara was the guy who you could kind of look to as that big centre. I think the Hawks needed a big centre, needed sort of a size upgrade almost on Onyeka Okongwu, who had a great season last season, but as I say, you can definitely upgrade in terms of size there, but they vote to go basically the complete opposite way, and I do find that really interesting. There's kind of fit questions all up and down this lottery board, especially, Drew. Like, people were saying that Darren Peterson is maybe the more natural fit for a team like the Washington Wizards. Again, that was where I like almost kind of disagreed in terms of, I think AJ's game is so well rounded that, like, to me, AJ DeBanza is just a wing, like nondescript wing, and you can play him basically 2 through 4 and work that out from there. You could probably even play him at the 1 these days with how the NBA is going and how positionless basketball continues to sort of, take different shapes and molds now. The Utah Jazz's fit with Darren Peterson is so interesting in terms of, like, I think of a Keontae George, Darren Peterson backcourt, the level of like basketball talent that is now in that backcourt, the level of talent full stop the Utah Jazz possesses is genuinely scary going into next season. If I'm Coach Will Hardy there, I'm looking at my roster and I'm like, God, like I don't even want an off season here. I want to go into the NBA season next week, because that is a seriously exciting level of talent the Utah Jazz now boast with him and, as I say, Keontae George in that backcourt. But then even as you move into the front court, there's so much to be excited about if you're a Utah Jazz fan.
Yeah, and then don't forget you got Isaiah Collier that's coming off the bench that was supposed to be a lottery out of USC. So you got a exciting 1-2 punch out of George and Peterson. And then you have the experience in the front court when you look at Lauri Markkanen, who had a fantastic year last year, Jaren Jackson Jr., and then don't forget about Bryce Sensabaugh. Like, he is just so underrated. And also their lottery pick from last year, Ace Bailey. So this team is talented. Like, they're in a position. I'm looking at their roster now. They clearly have 8 or 9 guys that's ready to go, ready to perform. And, that's obviously if they bring Kessler back as well. Going back to Atlanta, I just thought of a point that maybe it was the money situation with Trae Young that they didn't want to pay him the money. It wasn't necessarily the player because, again, you know, the way your roster has to be constructed now, you can't tailor 30% of your salary cap to a player. You can, but it can't be a guy that's 6 foot. So maybe that's just the case there. You get a smaller version of Trae Young and Kingston Fleming. Yeah, but it's very interesting with Sacramento, A. Cup Jr. You know, how does that roster look? Because I think it's fair to say that when you look at every roster in NBA, the Sacramento Kings is the one that makes you scratch your head the most. Just, you know, with a bunch of has-beens on the team. So is this the beginning of refreshing, the restart? But then again, like, we know they're not going to be competitive next year, but are you going to be good enough? I love to be able to say that. Are you going to be good enough to get a top 3 pick? Because you can't be terrible. So there's going to have to be some moves to be made with Sacramento. I know New Orleans, they're looking at this draft just, you know, on day one with no action as well. How does that look? What do you do with that roster? It's just exciting times at Caleb Wilson, who they you know, you can make an argument for him to be the number 1 pick. The Bulls starting to refresh. I mean, when you look at the Bulls roster, they have a lot of talent as well. You know, so you can argue for a lot of teams, but I think we'll really be able to understand how these teams look once free agency officially kicks in. When is it? Next week is usually right after the draft.
Yeah, I mentioned it on a couple of pods last season that I almost felt like robbed by, I think even maybe at the start of last season, I was saying like there's so many teams who you feel like can go out and win now here, and you ended up with basically a few of those teams even like going and tanking, because this was obviously a great draft class that a lot of people wanted to be in on, and especially a lot of those guys at the top of this draft having their own draft picks too. You can kind of understand now why they made those sacrifices, but with the NBA bringing in these anti-tanking measures and, you know, going into next season, there's now so many of these teams where I'm like, oh, I can see a world in which these guys can win now, and there's especially a couple in the sort of, you know, the early teens picks there that I'm looking at and being like, those are guys that have deliberately been picked because that fits a hole in their roster or something along those lines. The Darius Acuff one is interesting, just before I sort of go into that a little bit further, because I don't know if you saw this, Drew, but Scott Perry used to coach Darius Acuff's dad, so I always think it's funny in the draft. Yeah, it's funny in the draft how these things kind of have a way of like figuring themselves out. It's almost like the team calls around and kind of has gentlemen's agreements almost with the front office to be like, this is who we're going to pick. If you just, you know, stay out of our way, then this will all be good, and we can all walk away from this happy. Maybe they were ringing the Brooklyn Nets and saying like, Mikael Brown Jr. is a really talented guy, you know, ringing the Clippers saying Keaton Wagler's a really talented guy. I never really saw Darius Acuff as like a fit for the Clippers. I saw a lot of people being like, he's the most electrifying, the most sort of talented from that 5 pick downwards, but to me, he's like a keys to the franchise kind of guy, and ultimately with Kawhi Leonard still in situ, like, you're not handing the keys to the franchise to this guy yet. Maybe that's not a thing, not a way the Clippers should look at it, but I almost think if I'm Darius Acuff, like, I don't necessarily want to walk into a team with Kawhi Leonard tomorrow, because if I have this, you know, electrifying offensive game, he said he models his game on, you know, the MVP version of Derrick Rose, then I want a team like how MVP Derrick Rose had the entire city of Chicago, to be honest, rather than just the Chicago Bulls. So I kind of think that even that 5 through 7, like, the Clippers got who they were meant to get, someone who fits alongside Darius Garland in that backcourt, while they kind of answer a few more of their roster construction questions over the next few years and give guys a bit more of a runway to do that. And then, yeah, as I say, the Sacramento Kings get their sort of vested interest in Darius Acuff, but also a guy that can just go, there you go, there's the keys to the franchise, you go and enjoy getting some bums and seats for our fans at the arena that we've so desperately needed for the past couple of years.
Yeah, the biggest kind of takeaway for me on night one was, where were the Europeans? Where were the international players, right? Like, who have dominated the draft, dominating the NBA. When you think about, you know, the all NBA first team, MVPs, all of that. But you just start to see this thing always evolves. Nothing ever stays the same. And the NCAA and NIL is playing a huge role in that. Guys, especially those international guys who would normally come over from, these big clubs overseas. But a lot of those guys have gone over to the NCAA and got that bag, $5 million. There's guys like Quinn Ellis making $8 million at St. John's. And so the whole trajectory has kind of changed. And maybe it's turning back to the Americans starting to, reign over the NBA once again. Very fascinating night in the draft. Really happy for a lot of these young guys. They don't understand, they probably do, how much their life is going to change. Who's going to be the bust? There's always bust. Who's going to be not even make it to their rookie extension, which there always are. Who's going to be the surprise? So you talked about it a little bit earlier. There's so many factors in being successful. It's not just about your talent. Fit is huge. Situation is huge. The front office is huge. All of these things play a factor in what success is. I read an article yesterday about kind of dissecting the first round picks over the last couple years, and only 6% of the first round picks since I don't remember the date that it said, going back to which draft, but have produced for the team they were actually drafted for. So think about that. So a lot of these guys, when you look 4 or 5 years, they're going to be in another uniform. That's how the NBA operates now, right? It's not for long. So only 6% of those guys over time produce for the team that they were drafted by.
Yeah, that's a really interesting statistic. And you mentioned the Europeans before as well, Drew. Like, I think we've probably been spoilt by like the Luka Doncic and Victor Wembanyama's of the world over the past few years. We did get those guys, as I mentioned, in the early teens before. Ade Mara coming out of Spain, Hans Steinbach going to the Charlotte Hornets as well out of Germany, Ade Mara going to the OKC Thunder. They were the sort of, almost I guess those three really were the interesting ones I mentioned, because in the Golden State Warriors and the OKC Thunder and the Charlotte Hornets, they're not necessarily teams that are still giving themselves any runway to be retooling or, going into young rosters. They are all teams that want to win now. The Golden State Warriors are trying to maximize Steph Curry's timeline. The more time that passes, the more I think there's a good chance that LeBron James ends up there for this like dream partnership with those two, and extends the Steph timeline a little bit more. They're getting Jaxer Lenderborg, who I think is going to be 24 by the time the season starts, so they're in theory getting like a ready-made NBA guy there, someone who can play power forward and center, almost in a small ball center way. So without the Draymond Green, everything else that comes with Draymond Green, there is a bit of a Draymond Green factor to Jaxer Lenderborg. If you think about Draymond as a guy who in his career has made shots, as a guy who play makes really well with the dribble handoffs and things like that, I can imagine Yax, slipping so nicely into that. Ade Mara for the OKC Thunder, basically to me feels like he fixes any concerns they had about Isaiah Hartenstein's money and having to pay him. It means that Isaiah Hartenstein probably just walks away from the OKC Thunder now, which will be a shame, but I think he will get paid elsewhere. It's a shame to sort of take him out of that championship core, and a core that seems to just be so close to each other as they sort of have been down the years now. It's a shame to sort of take him out of that, but as I say, I'm sure he will get paid elsewhere. And then Heinz Steinbach for that Charlotte Hornets team just gives them a bit more size in that front court, a guy who's apparently a really good rebounder, can slot in nicely alongside Moussa Diabate, and you can kind of not imagine any other team getting any boards against them with those two guys, and the energy they will bring on the rebounding side of the ball, real size in that front court now. And again, for Charlotte, another guy who, early 20s, I believe Hans Steinbach is a German prospect, a European to bring to that team, a European that slots alongside Moussa Diabate, of course, as a Frenchman in that front court too. So they felt like the three picks of that top 15 where you were like, okay, I can see exactly where that player just like slots really nicely into that rotation, and in theory that just works from day one.
How much do you think that Mara pick for OKC Thunder had to do with the Victor Wembanyama stopper? Because he has a 9'9" wingspan at 7'3". Did you think that played a role? I definitely think the Michigan angle coming from a winning program, because OKC Thunder is about winning titles during this stretch. But I'm just curious to get your thoughts on the Victor matchup.
Oh, for sure. It's 9-9 standing reach, isn't it? Which is I think broke a record at the combine. So like, freakish length from a Daymara. I'm absolutely certain that is a thing. Like in theory, you bring in a guy that's got more size than Chet Holmgren, can be a backup to Chet at that 5. If you did want to rock with Chet at that 5, of course, can slot in alongside him into that front court as well. To me, that was like it gives us a clean way of getting off the Isaiah Hartenstein money. It has us not having to think about that second apron thing for you kind of kick that down the road for another year or two. Of course, I made the trade the other day for Aaron Wiggins, 2 and 2 second round picks, which I don't know if that was one of them where like almost like the Luka to the Lakers thing where one team just kind of called another team and there was no bidding war, because I was surprised that you only ended up getting 2 second round picks for Aaron Wiggins. Really, from OKC's point of view, I understand wanting to get off that money. He was someone I'd identified when we'd had conversations about this, sort of saying that that is easy money for them to get off for a guy who couldn't get minutes in the playoffs necessarily. But the talent of Aaron Wiggins is still there. So if you're the Hawks, like I'm rubbing my hands together at the idea you can get him for just 2 second round picks. But having got off that, you then just drop the Isaiah Hartenstein piece in free agency now, and then suddenly you're apron compliant again. So makes a ton of sense for the OKC Thunder, and especially as you said, in that sort of Wemby stopper role as well.
I'm interested to see what Washington, because now I'm starting to think about, who do we think won the draft? And immediately Washington just comes to mind because it's just all unfolding perfectly for them. They have so much young talent that they already have. Now you add A.J. DeBansta, who is a cornerstone. You got Trae Young there. Don't worry about that. Great players make all that work. But, the burning question for me is what happens with AD, because AD wants a max extension. I don't think he's getting it. If he doesn't get it, is he unhappy? Is he going to provide the veteran leadership for, a young core? So it's really, because there's been a lot of smoke coming out of that direction about what he wants to do. So really interested to see what they ultimately end up doing with AD and where he lands, or if he's going to stay, or what kind of money he's going to get. But I really like what Washington is building. I am just really excited to see. I mean, again, we talked about it on the last episode that this previous season was so great, despite that window that we had where teams were. I think they it was 29 straight losses from teams that were positioned in the lottery, maybe even more than that. Can't remember off the top of my head, but that's gone now. Every night you're going to get quality basketball because you can't take anything for granted. That might be the one game that knocks you out of the lottery. So just think of an 82-game playoff experience that we just witnessed. Obviously, it won't be at the same intensity, but from a competitiveness level, I'm just so in favor with this anti-tanking rule, and to be able to have a reason to watch basketball in late January on a Tuesday night, it's all going to matter now. So, and I say that because it started last night with this draft, and it's very clear that teams are positioning themselves. They are drafting to be good now. Maybe not great, because you're not going to be great, especially if you're a young team, but at least good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of incentive for teams to be, fun young teams now, kind of avoid those relegation spots, try and aim for that just outside of the play-in without falling through that trapdoor. I even think you look at that Julius Randle trade and what the Brooklyn Nets sort of get out of that. In theory, I think you get a guy in Julius Randle who can just win you a couple of extra games if you decide to keep him around. Yeah,
exactly what I thought.
You literally just keep him around for whatever is remaining of his contract, or just for the season until he becomes an expiring next season. And yes, he wins you a couple of games with that young core, keeps you above those relegation spots. I think you even see it in the Bucks trade with Giannis, which I'll just steer on to for the last couple of minutes, Drew, while I've still got you here. Your sort of reaction to this Giannis trade, because that was exactly what I thought when I saw that King's ransom almost that the Milwaukee Bucks got back for Giannis, in terms of like a treasure trove of picks, of course, but a treasure trove of players too. They basically got a whole starting 5 back from the Miami Heat for Giannis Antetokounmpo there, and I look at like a Tyler Herro who can slot in alongside Braden Burries now in that backcourt that they drafted last night. You've got Jaime Jaquez Jr. who could play at the three, Yakachonis who can come off the bench as your sort of backup guard there, Kalel Ware who slots in at the center, and then Nate Ament was the other guy that they drafted. You've basically, in the past 48 hours, that's your top seven of your rotation basically, and you can work out the rest from there, whether you decide to pay guys like Ryan Rollins or Kevin Porter Jr. and players like that who have contributed this season. But I'm so intrigued by fit. Like every time I was looking at the draft board last night, I was like, oh, how does this person fit there? Especially for me, of course, as a Clippers fan, how does Keaton Wagler fit with the Clippers? And that was why I feel like the Clippers made that pick, was because of fit. This is the one bit where I'm kind of scratching my head from Miami's point of view, is like, listen, if there's one coach in the NBA who can figure this out, I would put it down to Eric Spoelstra to be able to figure this out. But how does Giannis Antetokounmpo fit in a front court with Bam Adebayo? And actually, Drew, are we seeing a bit of a return to like almost grit and grind teams here, where you go back to two, maybe, I know Giannis is not like a traditional big, but two guys with real size in the front court. Even looking at Cambuza sort of flipping back to the draft as a more ground bound size, using player. How does he fit alongside Zach Edey? Well, maybe it's just the idea that, similar to what Miami, I think, will look to do with Giannis and Bam, is that, yes, at times the spacing is going to be a little bit clunky, but we've got two real inside presences who've got all the physicality in the world and basically all the best of the other team who's trying to stop that.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack there, and all you got to do is look at the NBA Finals, right? I wouldn't necessarily say that the New York Knicks and the San Antonio Spurs were teams that just played this Golden State pretty basketball that we've been accustomed to. They can, right? But one thing that both of those teams could do as well is that they could play messy. They could defend. You look at New York Knicks, they could bring Mitchell Robinson in and just muddy it up a little bit. The same with the San Antonio Spurs when they bring Dylan Harper in to change the game. Again, you just have to have versatility, and you have to win in multiple ways. And that's the first thing I thought with Miami. My initial thought was, kind of like, how does that fit with Adebayo? But then I thought, what did we talk about all season? There were a couple teams that we talked about who are just sitting in this no man's land, this abyss, and the Miami Heat was one of those teams, right? They're a team that's never too bad where they're going to get a top pick, and they're a team that just wasn't good enough to compete for a championship. So they had to make a move like this, even though I was on the record saying I wouldn't give up all of my assets for a Giannis, but Miami was one of the few teams that I think you got to swing for the fences and see what happens. They'll build around it later. I think it'll take a little bit of time to build around this roster, but the way that Giannis plays, he plays messy. And so, all of a sudden, don't be surprised if you start seeing Bam shooting a lot of corner threes this offseason. They'll figure that stuff out. You gotta get talented players on their roster, and I love it for Milwaukee. I can understand why they made this deal over Boston. I saw something on X that it was reported that Jimmy Haslam, who is the owner, he didn't want to deal with the same situation with Giannis that you get Jaylen Brown in, and all of a sudden a year down the line, he's looking to be moved. He just wanted to get a bunch of young assets, which Milwaukee did. A lot of pieces, and you just kind of see what sticks, see who's going to be there for the future. But they're in a position to be a fun, good team. They're not going to be terrible. So, again, they're good enough to fall in the top 5 lottery if it gets bad enough or good enough. I don't even know how to describe that now with the way the new draft reform has come. So, I loved it for Milwaukee. You got picks coming as well. But then for Miami, we'll figure it out later. You do still have Andrew Wiggins, who's a top pick. I don't think you have enough money to keep Norman Powell. That's the only question mark, because I really love I think Norman Powell fits perfectly there. Mitchell again, Davion Mitchell, he's not a shooter, so it will get clunky. But, hey, maybe they're saying we're going to hang our hats on defense. We're going to get stops, and then we know we can get points in the paint because we got two guys, one guy that has 83 points, a lot of that done in the paint, and then we know what Giannis provides as well. But then you got one of the best coaches in the league that can figure that all out from a conditioning standpoint, no one does it better than the Miami Heat to make sure they got guys that can go hard, that can make sure that, Giannis can stay healthy, but that has the ability to just kind of play like this old school throwback style. Let's just go out there and play hard. And I like that from Giannis' perspective because he fits the mode of what the Miami Heat has been about all of these years.
Yeah, maybe with a guy like Norman Powell, they'll just try and look to do something a bit more team-friendly but longer term that protects Norman Powell, because I think he's like 31, 32, so kind of protects him later into his NBA career, and they can kind of, almost sell it to him on that, like you're getting plugged into this, what we believe is now a championship contender. Yes, you might be able to get more money elsewhere, but we don't think you'll be able to contend elsewhere, and also we'll give you the years to sort of, almost bulk that contract up, give you the security for a longer time. Really interested to see how that shakes out, because there are some obviously roster construction conversations that will happen over the next few weeks. How will the Boston Celtics reintegrate Jaylen Brown? I was just reading a quote from Brad Stevens about that as you were talking there, Drew. So there's definitely some interesting question marks, but we will discuss those over the coming weeks. Luckily, me and Drew are going to be together in Las Vegas for NBA Summer League. So whether things happen before then or not, and we have to come and jump on the pod, come into our war room here at Crossover the Pond HQ and discuss some moves that happen over the next few weeks, or whether it's just that me and Drew get something out to you guys in Vegas where we kind of take a bigger picture look at the league going into next season and situations like the Jaylen Brown thing, and discuss between us how that will shake out. We'll hopefully have some cool interviews and things, and definitely some cool content that will come from that trip. So really, really looking forward to that. Thank you to Drew and Yvonne from 21 Media Productions for putting that on a plate for me and Drew to go out there and enjoy all that Las Vegas has to hold for us for this NBA Summer League tournament. But I'm gonna have to let Drew go and be an adult, go and be a parent, and look after the family there. So the last thing for me to say on this NBA Draft special episode of Crossover the Pond is for Drew to lead us out.
Yeah, really looking forward to learning a lot about these picks. Because as we mentioned before, we don't follow college basketball that closely, so excited to be out there in Vegas with you, to see them up close. Excited for the fans that tune into this podcast to be able to bring you that information directly from the sources, and also be able to create some cool content. But that trip in a couple of weeks is just going to set the tone on an incredible, exciting season here for Crossover the Pond as we look to take things up to another level. But before then, you know what to do. Go hit subscribe, go like, go tell a friend to tell a friend that you need your basketball fix here on this side of the pond. We got you. Drew, Josh, we sign out. Peace out.